So we've now discussed the Constitutional Convention and the structure of the government that was created there. We went through the structure and powers of Congress in a lot of detail. We went through the presidency and the powers associated with the presidency. Now I'd like to go through the Supreme Court and its powers in greater detail. First of all, the number of justices decided by Congress. First Supreme Court had 6 justices, and that was decided through the Judiciary Act of 1789, which we will mention again in a few minutes. Today's court has 9 justices. One of the justices is Chief Justice. The rest are known as Associate Justices. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is that the change made between 1789 and today should be noticeable, that you go from an even number to an odd number. And the reason they did that is so that there would never again be tie votes on the Supreme Court. The Constitution proclaims that all Supreme Court justices serve for life in good behavior. That means a justice can be impeached, just like the president can. Any public official can be impeached. The Judiciary Act of 1789 that I mentioned before organized all of the lower federal courts as well. The original system that was created had district courts for each state, and then 3 courts of appeals, one for the New England states, one for the middle states, and one for the southern states. As the country has grown, so have the number of district courts. In the year 2000, there were 94 district courts and 13 circuit courts. So that's more than 1 district court per state. States like New York have numerous district courts, especially in densely populated areas like New York City. And then the 13 circuit courts are strategically placed around the country to serve all of the regions of the country today. The appeals process. At the state level, you would have trial courts, probably even all the way down to the county level at that point, that would work their way through the state appeals court system, and then eventually, if need be, to the Supreme Court. At the federal level, you might have a case on appeal at the district court level, and then make its way up to the circuit court level, and eventually to the Supreme Court. So there are a couple different ways for a case to make it to the Supreme Court. Original and appellate jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction means that a lower court originally heard the case. Originally. So the very first time that a case is being heard by the court is original jurisdiction. Appellate jurisdiction belongs to higher courts that hear cases on appeal. Appellate, appeal. The words are very much the same. The only time the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction instead of hearing a case on appeal, so normally they have appellate jurisdiction. The only time they have original jurisdiction is when a case involves an ambassador or a dispute between 2 states. Those are the only 2 circumstances that the Supreme Court would have original jurisdiction. There are some landmark decisions of the Supreme Court that you absolutely, positively must know. Perhaps one of the most important Supreme Court cases in all of American history is Marbury v. Madison. It is heard in 1803. Just before leaving office, after losing re-election, President John Adams appoints William Marbury to a federal court judge position. The next president who replaced him, Thomas Jefferson, orders his Secretary of State, James Madison, to block the appointment so that he could make a new appointment for the position. Marbury appeals to the Supreme Court, saying that in 1789 law, the Federal Judiciary Act, required Jefferson to carry out Adams' appointment. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote the majority opinion and said that the court decided that the 1789 law Marbury was using to argue his case was a violation of the principles of the Constitution, or unconstitutional. Now, that doesn't mean that the decision declared the entire Federal Judiciary Act unconstitutional. What it's saying is that Marbury's argument using that law was unconstitutional. So Marbury losing his appointment and Thomas Jefferson appointing someone new was declared perfectly acceptable. I bolded and italicized the term unconstitutional. Very, very important when you're dealing with Supreme Court cases. If something is acceptable, it would be known as constitutional. The Marbury case established the principle of judicial review. Again, I bolded and italicized this. Very, very, very important term to know. That allows the Supreme Court to overturn any unconstitutional federal or state law or action of government as well. The next Supreme Court case to know, McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819. The issue at hand in this case was whether the state of Maryland was able to tax a bank chartered by the federal government, because the federal government is supreme to the state governments. In his majority opinion in McCulloch v. Maryland, John Marshall is quoted as saying, "The power to tax is the power to destroy." This case established the idea that any state law that contradicts federal laws is nullified or declared void, because the federal law is supreme to the state law. So, federal supremacy. Next, you have Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824. The issue in this case was whether the state of New York was allowed to give only one steamship company the exclusive right to operate on an interstate waterway, which in this case is the Hudson River. Ogden, the defendant in this case, had been given such an exclusive right by the state of New York's government. Another trader or merchant, Gibbons, challenged this exclusive right. Marshall in the court stated that the Constitution granted the federal government the power to regulate interstate commerce, and that allowed for New York State's law to be nullified by the federal government. This case reinforced the idea that the federal government and its laws are supreme to the states. Again, federal supremacy. Now, the significance of the Marshall Court. John Marshall is a name that you gotta know. One of the most significant judicial figures in the history of the country. His court decisions are important for establishing the concepts of federal supremacy, which would include the McCulloch case and the Gibbons case, as well as judicial review, which is what makes the Marbury v. Madison case so very famous. That is it for this presentation. Please make sure that you go to the website and take the online quiz. Make sure to use your notes on this quiz so that hopefully you receive a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.